Okay, moving on to the last and final college basketball segment of today's show that we will be going over today. I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the more impressive teams from the opening weekend of college basketball, and that was Mark Few and his Gonzaga Bulldogs, who went into Fort Myers, Florida, and really just beat up and handled their business against Kansas and Auburn. And the game against the Jayhawks, it was competitive, but it never really felt like Kansas was ever in jeopardy of losing. And if you look at the score, Gonzaga actually ended up winning by 12. They then ended up destroying Auburn, winning that game by 23. And if you watch the game, it really wasn't even that close. And I feel like one of the main takeaways from most people after watching that Gonzaga game was that they look like the best team in college basketball. And this weekend, there were 4 top 10 teams that lost. And Gonzaga, to me, was the most impressive team of the weekend. And undisputably right now, they look like, to me, the best team in the country. And on Thanksgiving, they went out there and handled their business against Kansas. And I just wanted to say, props to both coaches for letting this game happen on Thanksgiving in the beginning of the season. And you guys also heard what happened with Gonzaga and the COVID protocols. You guys know that in Florida, they weren't as strict. The protocols weren't as some of the other venues. That's basically what happened in South Dakota. So it was no surprise that even with the one Gonzaga player testing positive, that they ended up playing this game. But Gonzaga just took on 2 teams they were favored against and really dominated both of them. And the whole Kansas game, it was great for the whole Gonzaga team. Everyone produced. Jalen Suggs was the real star, and you were able to see in that game that a big man, Drew Timme, has really improved for this Gonzaga team. And as good as Gonzaga looked in that Kansas game, I think you could even make the argument that they looked even better against Auburn. And there are going to be a lot of very good teams in college basketball this season, right? Baylor is going to have their moments. Villanova is going to have their moments. And I believe there were times in that game for Villanova against Arizona State where they looked like, to me, one of the best teams in college basketball. I believe Jeremiah Robinson-Earl had like a 5-minute stretch where he was just balling out, and he looked absolutely unbeatable. And there's some other really good teams. Illinois has looked really good in their first couple of games. Tennessee hasn't played a game yet. I'm really high on them. I even think Kentucky, by season's end, will be right in the conversation. As I mentioned, Baylor. But at the same time, I do think right now I feel confident in saying that Gonzaga is the most complete and the best team in college basketball. They have 3 sick guards on the team right now because Jalen Suggs, I feel like he was a guy who really is able to put Gonzaga over the top. He had 24 points and 8 assists against Kansas. They also bring back Joel Ayayi. He's a great creator, great two-way player, and I think eventually, before his career ends, is going to play in the NBA. They also bring in Andrew Nebhart, the transfer point guard from the University of Florida, who it was unknown really the whole offseason if he was going to be the Zags' backup point guard, if he even was going to be eligible. And he, right now, I think is in the proper role at Gonzaga, but I think Mark Few needs to be careful because this is a guy that is going to go from playing about 32, 33 minutes a game as the starting point guard of the University of Florida to now going to be a backup point guard at Gonzaga, a team that, let's just face it, has guys that are going to be suited to play more minutes than him. I like the way Gonzaga was able to execute that small lineup when they played Jalen Suggs at the 1, Nebhart at the 2, Ayayi at the 3, Kispert at the 4, who is really good at shooting. He could really help the Gonzaga Bulldogs spacing on the floor, and Drew Timme, who obviously the big man, he looks much improved compared to last season. So I feel like when Gonzaga is playing that small ball lineup, it could work. And that was a lineup that not a lot of people necessarily expected the Bulldogs to be using when you consider the fact that it was unknown that Andrew Nebhart was really going to be eligible by the start of the season. And you look at that kind of lineup and you look at the core that this Gonzaga team is built around. They have no weaknesses. They could shoot. They're athletic. They could run. They could play in the half court. And I feel like going back to Jalen Suggs, what separates Gonzaga this year in terms of their national championship chances from any other year is their point guard. And I even think last year, if the NCAA tournament would have went down, I would have picked Gonzaga to make the Final Four. I think they would have had a very good chance to win the national championship the way Ayayi and Kispert and Philip Petrusev and Tilly and Woolridge. That was one of Mark Few's better teams at Gonzaga. I remember watching them play a game early in the season against Washington and really saying to myself going into that game, oh, Gonzaga lost Rui. They lost Josh Perkins. There's no way that they're going to be able to be anywhere near as good this year as they were the season prior. And Gonzaga consistently was one of the 2 or 3 best teams in all of college basketball last year. Now, this year, they lose Petrusev, they lose Tilly, but now Drew Timme is back. He's improved, and they bring in a guy in Jalen Suggs, who is that lead guard that I believe this Gonzaga team has that not a lot of other Gonzaga teams of the past have had. Gonzaga has usually had that prototypical college point guard on their really successful teams. Your Kevin Pangoses of the world, your Josh Perkins of the world. And those guys were really good college basketball players. There's no doubt about that. What they were able to do for the Gonzaga program really should mean a lot, and their impact and legacies will be remembered forever. But at the same time, I believe this year, with an NBA player at point guard like Jalen Suggs, who could be the best freshman in this recruiting class, there were many people, including myself, that were all hyped up about this freshman class, and some of the other guys not named Jalen Suggs, like Cade Cunningham of Oklahoma State, who has been absolutely incredible so far. But let's face facts. I think we could all agree Oklahoma State is not as good as Gonzaga. We look at Kentucky and the freshmen they have, B.J. Boston and Terrence Clark. Those guys are going to be really good players, but at the same time, their team did not look as good as Jalen Suggs' Gonzaga team did over this past weekend, and Jalen Suggs was able to lead the Bulldogs to a big-time win over Kansas, another big-time win over Auburn, and I believe when you have a point guard like that, that's super dynamic, this guy could be the most dynamic player in all of college basketball. That is something that this Gonzaga team has that even the team 2 years ago with Rui and Josh Perkins and Zach Norvell, multiple NBA players on that team, and unfortunately they weren't able to get the job done as they lost to Texas Tech in the Elite Eight. And keep in mind, that was the same Gonzaga team that ended up beating Duke to start off that regular season. So the Bulldogs have had some very successful teams in the past, not even to mention the team with Nigel Williams-Goss and Zach Collins, another team with multiple NBA players that was one win away from winning a national championship. And maybe if the refs had their act together, they could have won that national championship game against North Carolina. But I do think this Gonzaga team has a chance to be the best team of the Mark Few era because of a point guard like Jalen Suggs leading the way, because of elite role players on the side like Corey Kispert and Joel Ayayi, and a guy in Drew Timme as your big man who is really improving and looks better and better and better. Now, the other thing I'll say about this Gonzaga team is this. I really like how Mark Few kind of pointed out that this could be the best team he's ever had at Gonzaga. And when you're Gonzaga and you play in a conference like the WCC, and I'll admit the WCC right now looks like probably one of the best or the second best mid-major leagues in college basketball, because besides Gonzaga, we know St. Mary's is always going to be right there in the conversation with Randy Bennett. I saw them play a little bit this weekend against Memphis. They looked good. They didn't win that game, but they looked fine throughout the South Dakota tournament. They also have BYU, who brings in Matt Harms, the transfer from Purdue. They bring back Alex Barcelo at point guard. BYU was a top 20 team in college basketball last year, and they were the only team in the country to beat Gonzaga. Not to mention San Francisco, who pulled off one of the bigger upsets of the weekend with their big-time win against the top 5 Virginia Cavaliers team. Pepperdine went into overtime against UCLA. So Gonzaga, their league is going to be very hard. But at the same time, I really like how Mark Few as usual, scheduled his non-conference slate, because even in a year of the pandemic where there's so many coaches, and I'm not blaming anyone, I'm just stating the facts, there are so many coaches around the country this season that have been a little hesitant to schedule non-conference games because of the protocols. If you remember, that South Dakota tournament with Memphis and West Virginia, Duke, Ohio State, Creighton, and many other big-time teams originally were supposed to be there, but they dropped out because they didn't necessarily agree with their protocols and whatever. They just decided not to play. Mark Few and his scheduling philosophy has really been the opposite of that. Gonzaga has scheduled every team that they have wanted to play, and that includes some of the better teams in college basketball. Not only the game that occurred this past weekend against Kansas, but how about this week against West Virginia? And West Virginia was really able to handle business against against Western Kentucky and against VCU during their non-conference tournament this weekend. And for me, it was how they were able to get the job done. Derek Culver was tremendous, putting up 23 and 17 in the second game of the season. Oscar Tshiebwe has been a premier defender and rebounder while he's not in foul trouble, and I was really impressed with the way he was able to stay out of foul trouble throughout the tournament against Western Kentucky and VCU, in which West Virginia was able to win. And the best news for West Virginia was their guards. They were playing phenomenal. Miles McBride, Sean McNeil were becoming go-to offensive players before our eyes, and I picked Gonzaga and West Virginia, both of these two teams, to make the Final Four before the season started. And I think this game this week, Gonzaga and West Virginia, is going to be a big-time watch because both teams could really play. I think Bob Huggins, this could be his best chance to win a national championship since he's been the head coach of West Virginia, and it's the best West Virginia team since the 2010 Final Four team. Bob Huggins went on John Rothstein's podcast, the College Hoops Today pod, and said that this is the best West Virginia team since then. So I'm really looking forward to see in a big stage against Gonzaga. These two teams have faced off in the NCAA tournament before. I'm curious to see what West Virginia could do because Kansas wasn't able to handle Gonzaga. I'm going to be curious to see if Baylor, without Freddie Gillespie and now Tristan Clark in a week, are going to be able to handle Gonzaga. And I do think West Virginia, if anyone could beat the Zags, it may be able to be them because of the toughness of Tshiebwe and Culver and of Bob Huggins' squad. And I'm really going to be looking forward to that game in a loaded slate of college ball we have this week. We'll also have Baylor and Illinois. That's going to be a great game. But yeah, just wanted to say shout out to the Bulldogs and the way they played over the weekend against Kansas, against Auburn. And I'll be really looking forward to see what they do in their boxing match against Bob Huggins and the Mountaineers.